would just like to welcome you to the Magic in the Moonlight Market. We're just talking about names, so I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Billy Ann Wu, and I'm the board chair and president of the Roedde House Preservation Society. And so my board of directors, along with myself and our staff, we run the Roedde House Museum here, so welcome. This is our first time running this market. I'm so glad that all of you could join us for our kickoff event tonight. I would like to start with acknowledging that where we are now at the Roedde House Museum in the west end of Vancouver is on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including those of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We are grateful to Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land long before we called it home, and we honor their resilience, wisdom, and strength. As mentioned, this is the kickoff event to our market days. Tomorrow will be open from 11 to 5, $5 at the door. I want to acknowledge our wonderful vendors this weekend, Kara, Paige, Laura, Chris, Joe, Sarah, Yasmin, and Caitlin, as well as our museum staff and volunteers for literally making magic happen tonight. The idea of this market started many months ago. As a bit of a backstory, Kara and I have known each other for more than 10 years, and it has been such an honor and wonder to watch her grow and evolve as she began to share more about her Raven's Veil and her different practices. I thought a collaboration between us beyond the chair could be possible, and here we are. One piece of programming I really wanted to integrate into this market was to have a speaker to share with us some of the historical context and background to spiritualism practices, in particular relation to the Victorian age, the time frame where the Roedde House Museum is connected. I also want to thank Board Director Taylor Tomko for introducing me to the right people who would eventually lead to our speaker tonight, Dr. Aren Roukema. Dr. Roukema is a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow and seasonal lecturer at the University of British Columbia. He has published on spiritualism and other esoteric currents in edited volumes published with Routledge and journals, including science fiction studies, in addition to a monograph, Esotericism and Narrative, the Occult Fiction of Charles Williams. Dr. Roukema is the editor of Correspondences, Journal of Esotericism. This talk will explore devices invented to communicate with the dead in late 19th and early 20th century spiritualism. From the moment of spiritualism's founding in 1848, its adherents have invented numerous devices to communicate with spirits or prove their ability to visit us in person as ghosts or hauntings. These technologies were based on the belief that the spirit world is a material realm, which we should be able to discover and therefore contact, if we could just discover the method. This talk will introduce the history and context of those ideas and introduce a number of objects developed by spiritualists, including the Ouija Board, the Spiritoscope, and spirit photographs. Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Billy Ann and Sarah and the rest of the museum staff for inviting me and hosting me so well and working my slides for me in a very 1970s sort of way. I actually wish I had psychic powers and I could just turn the slides with my mind, but I don't. So yes, as Billy Ann said, I'm just going to talk about spiritualism, and because this is a very object-oriented museum, I'm going to focus on some of the objects and devices of spiritualism. And I've kind of worked this talk off of an item that is in the museum's collection, which is an Ouija board from, they estimate, the 1930s, 1940s. The Ouija board was actually invented around 1890. As you'll see, it has some precursors as well. In case you're not familiar with it, I think most of you will be. Basically, one or more people put their hands on this planchette here, and then all sorts of demons, spirits, various supernatural agencies speak through the Ouija board by kind of moving it around and spelling out words or indicating numbers, yes, no, if they're very simple spirits. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this concept. Ouija boards have been popular since they were invented. They had some really high points in the 1920s and 1960s when they actually outsold Monopoly as a sort of recreational pastime. They are now, I would say, mostly focused. They're kind of understood as a deep, dark, demonic item that you might risk possession by some sort of entity and require an exorcist, which is literally the film that kind of shifted that perception and made us think about Ouija boards this way. But that's a relatively recent pop culture effect. Prior to the 1970s, they were both more popular and much less negatively viewed. So I'm going to kind of explain some of that earlier heritage today. In order to explain that heritage, I need to talk about spiritualism, because that's the movement from which the Ouija board emerged. Spiritualism, put very basically, is a religio-scientific movement that really focuses on talking to the dead in all sorts of ways. But there are a whole bunch of other phenomena that kind of rose around it, some of which I will touch on later. In this talk, I'm going to introduce spiritualism to you and then just kind of go through some of the important, interesting objects that kind of rose both, they were designed to talk to the dead, but also to kind of test the possibility of talking to the dead. And I just want to note before I start, I'm not really interested in this talk in the question of whether Ouija boards work or whether there are spirits we can talk to. I'm sure everyone here has their own opinion on that. This is more of like a historical talk. I'm not trying to insult anyone's current views or change them, okay? So if I do offend you, please come afterwards and we'll have like a COVID-appropriate air hug or something. Yeah, so I want to be guided in this talk by this text from an early ad for an Ouija board, which says here, probably in the back, you can't read that, so I'll read it out. The Ouija board furnishes never-failing amusement and recreation for all classes, while for the scientific or thoughtful, its mysterious movements invite the most careful research and investigation, apparently forming the link which unites the known with the unknown, the material with the immaterial. Okay, so this ad, this idea of connecting the material and the immaterial, the idea of connecting amusement with scientific process, this is based in decades of similar crossovers in spiritualism. So this idea, which probably seems very strange to some of you, would not have seemed strange in the 1890s, just because of the 40 years of spiritualist discourse, spiritualist rhetoric that had preceded it. So I want to explore that crossover in this talk and talk about how some of the spiritualist objects indicate it. Slide. But first, some history. For those of you who aren't familiar with spiritualism, this will be a very basic history. It's a very complex movement. If you're interested in it, you will have to go home and hit some sort of Wikipedia level type research source and move on from there. So in 1848, there were two sisters, Margaret Fox and Kate Fox, who began hearing or began claiming to communicate with a peddler through a series of knocks and rappings in the walls of the house. And they worked out a way to actually communicate with this peddler so that first it could answer yes or no questions, and later even use a sort of alphabet system to pass messages to them. And this drew crowds of people to Hydesville. It was a time of real religious fervor, a time where people were really interested in these concepts. Their sister Leah Fox quickly developed this same ability, and they also drew a man named Isaac Post, a reformist Quaker who became very excited in their ideas, published about them, and within a couple years there was a national furor over these sisters and their mediumship capabilities. Spiritualism spread within 2 to 4 years all across America. By 1852 it was in Britain, and from there it spread around the world. But I would say it has remained a sort of Anglosphere phenomenon more than anywhere else in the world. It can still be found all over the world, but it was always really big in English-speaking countries. Sorry, one sec. It was most popular between 1850 and 1920. The spiritualists estimated that there were millions of spiritualists all over the world. Scholars now estimate significantly below that, but it was still quite an important movement. In 1897, the New York Times said there were 8 million worldwide, so that's a fairly significant source. And it tended to rise and fall in popularity. So after a war, the Civil War, World War I, where you had a lot of people dying, spiritualism became more popular as people wanted to contact their loved ones. But even if you weren't a spiritualist, you weren't interested in the movement, you didn't pursue participation in seances or interest in mediumship, you would have known about spiritualism. It was well known to everybody, so much so that people who thought it was ridiculous still had to take time to make clear to everyone that they thought it was ridiculous. So, for example, Robert Browning, Charles Dickens, Herman Melville, they all published poems, stories, kind of satirizing spiritualism. They saw this as a necessary thing to do and a thing that their readers would kind of click with, right? The thing about spiritualism, though, is it doesn't really have, like it sounds like a movement, like a tradition, like Christianity or Judaism, but it really isn't quite like that. It's more like that today, but in the 1850s to 1920s period, it was a very diverse set of ideas and practices. The one commonality it really had was this idea that the spirits existed and that we could communicate with them. Another thing that was really important was the idea of mediumship. Mediums weren't new. This idea that people could communicate with the dead wasn't new, but spiritualists really went about kind of codifying their practices, and a culture of mediumship rose up through spiritualism. Some of the central powers, the most common powers that were attributed to the mediums were clairvoyance, so the ability to kind of see otherwheres, other places and other times, either the past or the future. And then most common, of course, the ability to hear spirits speaking to you or facilitate spirits, moving objects, wrapping walls, wrapping furniture, that sort of thing. Okay? Now, as I said, this wasn't like a new concept. People had been claiming to be able to communicate with spirits for a very long time. The spiritualists often pointed this out. For example, some of you might be familiar with the Witch of Endor from the Bible. This was a scene where King Saul asked a witch to raise up the spirit of Samuel for him. And spiritualists, most of whom were Christians, were very fond of pointing at this history of spirit communication. It was also a time of religious fervor in upstate New York, in Hydesville, where spiritualism started. There were other movements where people were claiming to speak with spirits. And a really important sort of movement that you might have heard of that was behind spiritualism was Mesmerism. It was a medical science founded in 18th century France. It's a very complicated, also fascinating history, which I encourage you to look into. But one thing that they discovered in mesmerism was the ability to cast people into a sort of trance state. A sort of unconscious mind took over, and they found that some of these people in the trance state were able to communicate with the dead. And they even called these people mediums. So you can see how spiritualism was building out of an already existing tradition. But spiritualism was specifically modern. It was very much a thing of its time. It was really interested in reformist movements, abolitionism, women's rights, that sort of thing, extension of the vote. And it had really two important characteristics that are crucial for understanding some of the spiritualist objects I'm going to talk about. One is kind of the focus on entertainment, or maybe the expansion of public entertainment in the period. So we're talking about illusionists, magicians, vaudeville, circuses. People had spare time for the first time in a long time, and they had spare money. They were looking for things to do to entertain themselves. It was the pre-film age. They couldn't just go to the theater or watch TV. So entertainments were widespread and important. Indeed, magicians, stage magicians, saw spiritualists as fellow illusionists, tricksters who were pulling fraud tricks over the people they were claiming to communicate with ghosts with. Spiritualists, of course, denied this, but a lot of magicians, including Harry Houdini, spent time trying to show how a spiritualist medium might accomplish the feats that they were claiming to accomplish. The second thing, spiritualism always claimed from the beginning, from Isaac Post's communications with the spirits in Hydesville with the Fox sisters, to be a science, to be scientifically legitimate and scientifically provable. The idea here was that there is a spirit world, and it is natural, it is material, it's physical, just like our world, but it's made of spirit matter. So the problem is we just can't see the matter that the spirit world is made out of. It's sort of a fine, subtle force. So for example, we have spiritualist Emma Harding Britton. She was a very famous medium. She speaks of spiritualism this way: the whole range of spiritual phenomena point conclusively to the truths of spiritual doctrines, placing religion no longer on the foundations of fleeting human opinion, human assertion, or theory, but on the enduring basis of scientific facts. Now, Britton didn't provide those facts here, but many scientists in the period did go about looking for them. There was a science in the period called psychical research, a sort of forerunner of parapsychology. You still have this today. People researching paranormal powers, established scientists doing that. So there were so many people testifying to be able to communicate with ghosts, or having seen people communicate with ghosts, that leading scientists thought, well, we've got to test this. Like, there's so many respected people claiming these things are true. We've got to actually apply scientific method to this. So Michael Faraday, a leading discoverer of electromagnetic effects, researched it. He rejected it. That was a big blow for spiritualism. But other scientists also investigated it. Perhaps the most famous one was Alfred Russel Wallace. He, if you're not familiar with the name, he discovered evolution at the same time as Charles Darwin, but Darwin published first. So another leading scientist in the period, very important scientist, he researched spiritualism, and he thought there was quite a lot to it. He never rejected it. He always remained open to the claims of mediums and psychics. So people like him gave the movement a lot of scientific legitimacy. Now, this science of the spirits might seem strange to our eyes, but you've got to think that in this period, the universe was being revealed as something completely different from what they thought it was. You had discoveries like electricity, late 18th, early 19th century, magnetism, the same thing. They were still finding out what these forces were and how they worked. Even now, if you really start thinking about how a magnet works, the human mind doesn't easily cognate that. And then you had something called the ether, and that's a theory that is no longer around. It was disproved by Einstein. But in that period, they believed that there's a sort of subtle force filling the entire universe, permeating our bodies, permeating objects, and that force was felt to carry all the other, that fluid, I should say, was felt to carry all the other forces. So electricity, light, heat sort of traveled along it. So it wasn't that crazy for people in this period to think, well, if these strange occult forces can travel through the ether, why not thoughts? Why not spirit thoughts? Why not actual spirit bodies? Okay? Connected to this, there was radical shifts. There were radical shifts in technology in the period. For example, the railroad. Spiritualist historian Kathy Gutierrez says, if something as common and humble as steam could bring a railroad to fruition, then hypothesizing that other powers could bridge death seemed for many the logical conclusion of the epoch. And you have other inventions that are quite similar. The telegraph, suddenly you could communicate with people across oceans. In fact, spiritualists often argued that the reason the ghosts started speaking to the Fox sisters in 1848 was the spirit of Benjamin Franklin had gone to the afterlife and spent time with other electrician ghosts developing a way for a spiritual telegraph to communicate between the dead and the living. So it wasn't so much that we figured it out, it was that the spirit world had made this advancement. So science and technology were at the core of this movement. All right, so that is a long but about as short as I could get it summary of what spiritualism was, how it worked. Let's go over some objects. There were hundreds of different things that psychics, mediums, spiritualists use to test the spirit world, to experience it. I'm only going to go through a few. I do advise you to look further on your own. It's all very interesting. But I think probably the biggest object, especially at first, was the Seance Table. The idea here was that the medium, I'm going to assume that this is the medium, but I'm not sure. The medium would sit around the table with the sitters at the seance. Everybody would usually be connected, usually through their hands, to enhance the flow of the occult forces, expanding the medium's powers. And at first, the spirits would usually communicate on the table through raps or knockings, or they would move the table. They would tilt it up and down. And the idea here was, if you ask the spirit a question, and usually they were looking for 3 possible answers: no, maybe, yes. No would be 1 knock, maybe would be 2, yes would be 3, that sort of thing. So a similar, simple type thing. They tried Morse code, and they tried, as we're going to see, alphabet-based communication similar to the Ouija board. Other things the medium could do at a seance, they could actually hear the spirit voices and relay the messages to the people sitting there. Or they could actually sometimes be possessed by the spirit, and the spirit could speak through their vocal cords. And I guess the explanation for this is, if spirits are impacting matter anyway, why not make the voice box work? Sorry, sticky paper. All right. So these tables, could I get a slide actually? Yeah. The tables, in addition to tilting, they could actually levitate. Sometimes it would rise above the floor. This was more just to show the presence of the spirits in the room. They weren't necessarily communicating, they were just showing off. And then there could also be all sorts of other objects, all the other furniture in the room. So, you imagine you have a seance in here, that table's floating up here, the chandeliers swaying back and forth, these things are flying off the shelves. The idea is just to show the ability of spirits to act on matter. Musical instruments would often float over the seance table, and sometimes they would even play. And flowers could actually emerge from the spirit world into the material world, spirit flowers. Another thing you might see is a disembodied hand kind of glowing in the dark over the seance table. That's another important thing. It would have been quite dark. The mediums found it easier to work without bright lights in the room, or the spirits did. And this is a cartoon from Punch magazine, kind of satirizing that sort of seance culture. So now I just wanted to go through some objects that kind of sit behind the history of the Ouija board. This is one of Robert Hare's Spiritoscopes, invented in 1853, so only 5 years after the Fox sisters' moment at Hydesville, which just shows you how fast spiritualism spread. Because this professor of chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania, initially hostile to spiritualism, advocated the theories of Faraday, rejecting them, was finally convinced to go to a seance, and he became more interested. He couldn't really, once he'd experienced it, explain what was going on. And at one seance, they were using an alphabet board, like basically a sort of alphabet laid out on a board for children to learn their letters, to communicate with the spirits. So people were moving their hands over the letters until the spirits rapped to indicate that that was the correct letter. And this was based on a process called alphabet calling, where the medium or people present would just call out letters until the spirit finally rapped, yes, X is the letter I was looking for. But that is obviously a very time-consuming method. So partly, Hare invented a way to communicate much faster, but mostly what he was trying to do was test whether spirit communication was real. He was at the seance with the alphabet board, and he received a message from his father from the afterlife, a detailed message written in fine English, and he was really interested in this, but he realized that the medium, who could also see the alphabet board, might be somehow frauding him. So he thought, well, I've got to take the medium out of the equation. So what he did was he invented a spiritoscope, and these are 2 other devices. This is a spiritoscope. Basically, you have the medium sitting at the table with her hands on the table so that the spirit force can pass through her. Then you have a screen where that 1 is, and that is preventing the medium from seeing the wheel. Okay, so now the medium can't be a part of transcribing that message in Hare's thinking. And then this is a wheel with letters on it, and as you'll see, they're kind of jumbled up, so the medium also can't predict where the letters might be on the dial because they're not in order. Okay? And then there's some weights and pulleys that twist the dial or turn the dial, kind of like a sort of wheel of fortune type thing when the spirits tilt the table. Okay, so that's the idea. So he conducted experiments with this. The first time he found it quite successful. The spirits actually managed to pass messages through. But in further experiments, he couldn't get it to work anymore. The spirits weren't participating. So he held a seance without a spiritoscope between the medium and the alphabet board. And the spirits were again able to communicate quite clearly. And they said the problem is the medium needs to see the letters on the board. And the reason for this is that they have psychic powers, so we can see through their eyes to see the alphabet board. We were looking through your eyes before, and you're just dull, man. Like, we just can't make out the letters. So Hare invented a second spiritoscope. In this one, the medium could see the alphabet board. I'm assuming this is just illustrated in kind of a 2D way, but in his write-up he says she can see this. But the medium's hands are sort of cantilevered on balls so that she can't manipulate the table. That's what his thinking was. Because she's kind of rolling this little board over the table, she shouldn't be able to tilt it up and down. And so he did the same thing, and now he found that with this second spiritoscope, he had, in his view, removed the medium from the equation, but the spirits were able to successfully communicate. And he built 4 other spiritoscopes. I'm not going to go through them all. And he found similar results, so he became convinced that spiritualism was a marvelous new proof of the spirit world, and he even published his findings in 1855. He was ridiculed in the scientific community, but became a real staunch defendant. Well, he died shortly after, but he became a really important figure in the spiritualist movement.
It wasn't really too much of a problem.
Yeah. He'd set it up beforehand, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So something that followed shortly after that was the planchette. Indeed, it had been invented around the same time in France. Made its way to Britain in the 1860s and was in the US by 1868. And I guess, as happens so often, once it arrived in the US, it became this big global fad. And people all over the place were buying these things. Now, interestingly, you didn't go to a curio shop or a magic shop or something to buy these things. You went to a toy store. Okay? So this shows that sort of intersection of entertainment, science, and religion that I was trying to explain. Basically, the idea here is the medium or the people sitting around the table put their hand on the planchette. You put a pencil in this hole, and the spirits can basically write messages by moving the planchette around the surface of a table. Okay? So it's called automatic writing, and this is a tool that was used for automatic writing. Now, this was important for the Ouija board history because pretty soon people started combining this planchette idea with an alphabet board. This is spiritualist Hudson Tuttle's psychograph, or dial planchette, invented in the early 1880s. This was also a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. On the back, Tuttle credited Robert Hare for the concept. And interestingly, Tuttle, as I said, was a spiritualist, not a toy maker. But he advertised this device as both something that could prove spirit communication and help it work, and a good evening's entertainment. Right? So he too was feeling this mix between entertainment and science. And then we have the Ouija board. You can see now, hopefully, that the inventors of the Ouija board were really just taking something that was essentially in existence and making a very successful product out of it. In fact, around about 1886, spiritualists themselves basically devised items exactly like this. The sort of clever part of the inventors of the Ouija board was just, figuring out how to make money from it. And eventually, at least one of them did make a lot of money out of it. It was invented as entertainment. It was sold in toy stores. It's still largely used that way, even with some of the occult connections, which I think are subsiding now with the help of shows like Stranger Things and that sort of thing. But it could also be used as a spiritualist device, and it was. It was used to communicate with the spirits. As you can see from this Norman Rockwell painting, it was very common, popular entertainment. You can see there's just light frivolity here, perhaps even a little bit sexy. There's nothing sort of demonic or occult about it in this period. Slide. So you have a number of other devices that come out around the same time as the Ouija board, shortly after. I just wanted to show them to you quickly, just to show all the different sort of objects that could be built on this idea. This one, the Planchette, just kind of goes back and forth, perhaps even more efficient. This one also sold pretty well. This was produced by the Two Worlds Publishing Society, which was a spiritualist publishing society. And you would buy this directly from them. So not a toy shop item. Slide. This one I put just because it looks really cool. I think it's kind of Art Deco style. I'm assuming it's from the 1920s. Same sort of a Ouija board, Planchette style idea. Slide. Okay, so moving on from Ouija boards and their predecessors. This is a spirit trumpet. So this was also invented in the late 19th century. The idea here is those spirit voices in the seances were sometimes very hard to hear. So the idea was that these large trumpets would amplify the sound. So what would often happen is the seance room would go dark, you'd sit for a while, and then through the medium, the spirits would energize the trumpet. It would levitate from the table. It might even start whizzing around the room. They often painted either the whole trumpet or the front. You can see it on this one, with some sort of luminous paint, so you could see it moving around in the dark. And then the spirit voices would be amplified through the trumpet at some point. So again, you have a crossover between technologies we're more familiar with and spiritualist technologies, because essentially what you have here is a spirit telephone, right? Of course, the telephone had been invented shortly before. Okay, and then one last sort of important object in the history of spiritualism, spirit photographs. So within a decade or two of Hydesville, 1860s or so, spiritualists became interested in merging spirit matter and physical matter. They wanted to make the spirits visible in our world. They figured if they are made of matter, there must be some way of, showing them, proving their existence. So there were a number of offshoots from that, including spirit manifestations. The mediums began to be able to literally bring visible spirits into the seance room. But a sort of object-oriented one is the spirit photograph. In 1861, William H. Mumler, a Boston photographer, announced that he had taken a photo of a spirit by accident. And he did that because of the presence of his wife, who was a clairvoyant medium. But he developed a technique for repeating this process, charged $10 a head, which I am not familiar with mid-19th century currency, but I imagine that's quite a bit of money, and became quite successful. People flocked to him to have photos with their loved ones or with famous ghosts. He was charged with fraud in 1869. It was a well-publicized trial. P.T. Barnum testified from the sort of illusionist side of things. But he was found not guilty. However, his reputation was ruined. He could no longer do spirit photography. But that didn't stop the practice from spreading, again, both sides of the Atlantic, becoming very popular. As photography equipment became more accessible, and as more people learned about techniques like long exposure, double exposure, it became more and more popular, more and more possible, I should say, to take spirit photographs. So here we have a couple of interesting examples. This one I just chose because it attracts me aesthetically. It's two parents with their deceased daughter. This one is an example of someone who would sit so that the spirits of some of the luminaries of past ages could be taken with them on the photo. So you have musicians, intellectuals, politicians. Does anyone know who this is?
Roosevelt?
No. It's Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, author of Sherlock Holmes. He was a convicted spiritualist and convinced spiritualist? Yeah, not in jail. And he really got into it because his son Kingsley had died during World War I of injuries gained at the Somme. So this is a picture of him with his son in 1919, which he was, for him and for many spiritualists, this was proof that of the spirit world, of the physical nature of the spirit world, and of our ability to contact it using science and technology. Okay, so as I said, there are many other objects of spiritualism. I really encourage you, to look up things like ectoplasm, spirit cabinets, spirit paintings, really some fascinating stuff there. And some of the devices they use to test mediums in psychical research, also very interesting. But I hope this introduction to a few of the main devices has shown the cultural importance of the objects designed by spiritualists, scientists, and game manufacturers to communicate with the spirit world. They remain valuable to us as reminders of a period in which the boundaries between science and religion, between material and spiritual, just weren't as clear as they might seem to us today. Similarly, the Ouija board and similar devices illustrate the multiple purposes possible for a historical object, some of them difficult to understand from our future perspective. A single spiritualist object like a planchette or an Ouija board could be a toy, could be a scientific device, it could be a religious tool, depending on who is using it. It could even be all of these things at one and the same time. Preserving these objects and researching their historical context allows us to also preserve memory of the strange uses and categories of use attached to them. The objects of spiritualism, like the movement's beliefs, might seem strange, irrelevant relics of the past, but they are markers of a tradition that was very influential in its own time and remains important today, both because spiritualism and mediumship remain a part of our society, and because of spiritualism's influence on culture, science, religion, and even casual gaming. Thank you.